Welcome back. We are right in the middle of really an exciting story of David and running from his son Absalom. We're at the point where David has entrenched Hushai into Absalom's government. Really, he becomes counselor to the usurper king, Absalom, and Ahithophel, who was an accomplice of Absalom, gives him some advice, including go after your father with 12,000 men and take them all out. And Hushai says, wait a minute, these are angry men of war who will fight not in villages. They're going to go out in the wilderness, so good luck finding them. And if you find them, they're going to fight like a mama bear who's had her cubs taken from her. And so he decides to take Hushai's advice. And so Absalom goes and hunts down his father, David. And interesting point in the story. Basically, a young boy saw the priest's sons and reports them to Absalom. And I evidently saw the priest's sons coming in and out of the city, probably carrying information to David. And so went and told Absalom. Absalom pursues the priest's sons to Bahurim, but a woman hid them in a well and lied, saying that they went over the brook, even though they were hiding under her protective custody. And when they couldn't find them, Absalom's men just returned to Jerusalem. David and his entire entourage now pass over Jordan and come to Mahanaim. And Ahithophel, and this is such an odd story, Ahithophel hangs himself. And I want to point out something here. Let's take a look at verses 24 through 29 of chapter 17. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom passed over Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. And Absalom made Amasa king of the host instead of Joab, which Amasa was a man's son, whose name was Ithra the Israelite. Then went in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister to Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So Israel and Absalom pitched in the land of Gilead. And it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim that Shobi, son of Nahash of Rabbah, the children of Ammon, and Machir, the son of Emiel of Lodebar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite of Rogelim, brought beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat and barley and flour and parched corn and beans and lentils and parched pulse and honey and butter and sheep and cheese of kine, which kine is cattle, so cow cheese, for David and for the people that were with him to eat, for they said the people was hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Now, I actually want to back up for a second and go back to verse 23 and address something before we move into that section. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, so when Absalom didn't take his advice, pouty baby, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, put his household in order and hanged himself and died and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. Basically, Absalom took Hushai's advice, did not take Ahithophel's advice. And I think this is a definite, and I'm going to point out the other side of it later on when we see somebody else being loyal, but this is blind loyalty. This is loyalty to a personality. This is loyalty. It's almost, I think of people like David Koresh or some of these other charismatic leaders who end up, the leaders commit mass suicide at the command of their follower. And Absalom's charming personality has turned into something much darker, I think, at this point. His bitterness has changed him. And Ahithophel is so blindly loyal and so craves the attention of and so is enamored by and literally worships the ground Absalom walks on, that when he doesn't take his advice, he goes and he hangs himself, commits suicide. I mean, that's pretty out there, don't you think? And so Absalom gives chase with all the men of Israel, and he puts Amasa in Joab's place as captain of the army. Absalom sets up base camp in Gilead. David gets to Mahanaim. When he got there, these men, Shobi, Machir, Barzillai, outfit David, give his army and him some food. because he said, your people are weary. So David has thousands of people with him, and he splits them into three groups, each with a captain. 1/3 under Joab, 1/3 under Abishai, and 1/3 under Ittai. And actually, I have a list of David's mighty men behind me. We will go through those as a list in a minute. And if God's word thought it was important enough to jot their names down eternally, then it's important enough for us to take a look at these folks. But these are, again, people of his mighty men. And David wanted to go with them, but literally the people would not let him. He did inform his captains to take it easy with my son. I want you to read verses 3 through 5 of chapter 18. And the people answered, thou shalt not go forth, for if we flee away, they will not care for us, nor if half of us die, will they care for us. But now thou art worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that thou succor us out of the city. And the king said unto them, what seemeth you best I will do. And the king stood by the gate side, and all the people came up by hundreds and by thousands. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. And all the people heard the king, gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim. So we have the battle of Ephraim wood here. So he says, take it easy on my son. Don't kill him, unless you absolutely have to. Go easy with the young man, even Absalom. So a battle ensues. David's men kill 20,000. 20,000 men. And then we see that Absalom gets his comeuppance. Take a look in verse number 9. And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, and said, behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. And Joab sent unto the men that told him, and behold, thou sawest him, why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said unto Joab, though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth mine hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against my own life. For there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself wouldst have set thyself against me. This messenger says, listen, he's hanging in a tree over there. And Joab says, why didn't you kill him on the spot? And remember, this is what I said in the last class. Remember, Absalom set all his barley fields on fire. I think Joab never forgave Absalom for that act. He never forgave Absalom for his disloyalty. And Absalom's own bitterness bred bitterness in others, and Joab could just never let this go. Just couldn't let it go. And so we see that the shoe is now on the other foot, and Joab now has the advantage. And this guy said, of course I wasn't going to kill the king's son. You heard what he said. Not only would he have had me ordered, he probably would have sent you to kill me. I'm not doing this. I'm not raising my hand against the king's son. Verse 14, then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. Murdered him. Against the orders of his majesty, I might say. This was not an act of war. This was homicide. Absalom was defenseless. This was not a duel. This was not Absalom charging against him. This was not self-defense. Joab saw where he could take advantage of his enemy, not David's enemy. I honestly don't really think this had anything to do with David, because David's commands were not to hurt the young man. If they could get away with it, not to hurt the young man. And not only does Joab not have to sit there in self-defense, he takes 3 darts and throws them through the heart of Absalom while he's hanging helplessly between heaven and earth by his hair. Verse 15, the 10 young men that bear... verse 15. And the 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood and laid a very great heap of stones upon him. And all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime, had taken and reared up for himself a pillar which is in the king's dale. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day, at the time 2 Samuel was written, unto this day, Absalom's place. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. They're excited. We won. And Joab said unto him, thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. I honestly don't believe that this is Joab trying to reverence the memory of Absalom. I just don't see that in his character and in his actions. I honestly think he wanted to be the one to go and tell David, and which is what happens. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. But Absalom was slain. He had long hair. Remember? He was beautiful. Had this long flowing hair. And he got his hair caught in the trees. And his mule walked on without him, left him hanging there. So he's stuck in the tree, hanging by his hair, quite literally. And Joab was told he was there. He went and shot him with 3 darts. Joab's armor bearers finished him off. They buried Absalom in disgrace, which, again, this is why I'm saying that don't go tell him, because the king's son has died. If he reverenced the memory of Absalom, he would have given him a decent burial. He threw his body into a pit in the woods and covered it with a great mass of stones. And so we see David's reaction when Joab tells him that his son is dead. Now this is down in verse 28, 2 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 28. And Ahimaaz called and said unto the king, all is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king and said, blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. And the king said, is the young man Absalom safe? First question out of his mouth, is my son okay? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And the king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. And behold, Cushi came, and Cushi said, tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushi, is the young man Absalom safe? You can feel the father's heart pounding in his neck as he needs confirmation that his son is still alive. I mean, so much. The baby born to Bathsheba is dead, and Amnon is dead, and now Absalom is we don't know, or he doesn't know. We know. He doesn't know. Verse 32, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushi said, the enemies of my lord the king and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt be as that young man is. And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went thus, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. And you can just hear the grief of a father's broken heart over the death of his son. Amazing picture of the grace of God, how often we are against God, and yet I sort of picture God like this. When we violate his law, when we violate our relationship with him, and when we turn unto our own way, and I think that God just weeps over the lost possibilities and the fact that he cannot bless us. And when I see that in David, I really feel like this is literally a reflection of God's broken heart over our sin. So Absalom is killed by Joab, and I sort of think Joab had a smirk when he did it. You decide for your own self. I like to use my imagination when I read the Bible, and I sort of think that Absalom's like, I gotcha. And sort of was like, let's do a little target practice. And he started to kill Absalom, thrust him through the heart 3 times with darts, had his men actually finish the job. And awful news of Absalom's death is a great grief to David, and David and Joab are going to have words here. We go on into chapter 19, and we read around verse number 5. Joab came into the house of the king and said, thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day hath saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons, and of thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines, in that thou lovest thine enemies, and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all we had died this day, then it would please thee well. And Absalom's like, David, you're not making sense. We were at war with this guy. This guy wanted to kill you and your children and your wives and your concubines. And the way you're acting, you almost wish he'd have lived and we had died. Well, that's a father's heart, isn't it? That's a father's heart. Verse 7, Now therefore arise, go forth and speak comfortably unto thy servants. For I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night. And that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now. Then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And all the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent. And all the people were at strife throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, The king saved us out of the hand of our enemies, and he delivered us out of the hand of the Philistines. And now he is fled out of the land for Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back? And King David said to Zadok and to Abiathar the priests, saying, Speak unto the elders of Judah, saying, Why are ye the last to bring the king back to his house, seeing the speech of all Israel has come to the king, even to his house? Ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye the last to bring back the king? And say ye to Amasa, Art not thou of my bone and of my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if thou be not captain of the host, before me continually in the room of Joab. And he bowed the heart of all the men of Judah, even as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word unto the king, Return thou and all thy servants. So the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to conduct the king over Jordan. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, remember we talked about him a while back, hasted and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David, and there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him, and they went over Jordan before the king. And there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household, or to do what he thought good. And Shimei the son of Gera fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan, and said unto the king, Let not my lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely the day that the Lord my king, that my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. For thy servant doth know that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come the first this day of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my lord the king. So, with a lot here in this passage, Absalom is slain. Joab blows the trumpet, stops the attack of the Israelite army, and Joab's men throw Absalom's body into a pit. We see that David removes Joab. They have words. David and Joab have words one with another. Joab's like, You're shaming us. You're shaming all of us. And David says, You know what? You're not my general anymore. And he puts Amasa, I think was his name, in his stead. Ahimaaz, I'm sorry, wrong part. Excuse me. David kept Amasa in position that Absalom had appointed him, which I think is a little odd, but David probably knew that the loyalty issues and whatnot would be absolved now that Absalom was actually out of the picture entirely. So he puts his post-rebellion government in place through the rest of chapter 19 and into chapter 20. We see that David forgives Shimei of the grievances. Remember, he's the one that mocked and threw stones at David and hurled accusations at him I believe it was when he was in Mahanaim. Anyway, and remember not Abiathar, he's the priest, but Joab's brother, was like, let's kill this dog. And David's like, my own son wants to kill me. This guy, sticks and stones, let him go. And so this is that same guy. Now he's like, I'm the first to meet you over the river. And you have to wonder, at least I wonder, because I think of these things, if Absalom had finally gained power, how would Shimei have handled that? How would Shimei have handled that? We can't really say. But David forgives him. And this is, again, a pattern in David's life. If Absalom had come to him, I think David would have forgiven him. David just is a picture of grace in so many instances, even over his enemies. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. So here's what happens. Starting in verse 24, which we're not going to read, David takes Saul's lands and he divides it equally between Mephibosheth and Ziba. Ziba has shown tremendous loyalty on his own, above and beyond Mephibosheth. And so Ziba, who was Mephibosheth's servant, is basically made a free man. Mephibosheth is given half of all Saul owned. Ziba is given the other half of all Saul owned. And you think, well, Saul had other children. Yes, he did. We're going to find out what happens to them later. Not a happy situation there. It's not really going to happen in David's lifetime, but I will wrap up some of these character stories, these subplots, because they bear on the lives of these people that we've been talking about along with David. David wants to be a blessing to Barzillai and bring him into his own house. Actually, let's read this. This is a beautiful story. We're in chapter 20 now, and verse 34. In chapter 19 and verse 34. This is just a beautiful, beautiful story. Barzillai says unto the king, how long have I to live that I should go up unto the king of Jerusalem? David actually wants to take care of him. Hey, live in Jerusalem. I will provide for you. I will provide a house for you. You won't have to worry about a thing in your whole life. But Barzillai is kind of old. We'll find out. He gives us, I think he's 80 years. Actually, I think this happens on his birthday because this is actually kind of cool when you read this. Verse 34, how long have I to live that I should go up with the king of Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old. So this is his 80th birthday. Can I discern between good and evil? Can thy servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any more the voice of singing men and singing women? Wherefore then should thy servant be yet a burden unto the Lord the king, my lord the king? Thy servant will go a little way over Jordan with the king, and why should the king recompense me with such a reward? Listen, I have very little enjoyment in life, he says. Verse 37, let thy servant, I pray thee, turn back again, that I may die in mine own city, be buried by the grave of my father and my mother. But behold thy servant Chimham, let him go over with the Lord the king, and do to him what shall seem good unto thee. And the king said, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do to him that which shall seem good unto thee, and whatsoever thou shalt require of me, that will I do for thee. I mean, what grace! What absolute grace from David. Verse 39, and all the people went over Jordan, and when the king was come over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned unto his own place. Then the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him, and all the people of Judah conducted the king, and also half the people of Israel. So, we're actually building up to something here in just a second, but I love this story. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful picture. It was enough for Barzillai to accompany the king back into his territory. That was all the dignity. That was all the reward he needed. He didn't do this stuff for his own. He didn't do this stuff to get in with who's in power. He didn't do that. He did this because he loved David. And Your Majesty, I don't need a reward. You know what? Take Chimham. Take him. Whatever you want to do with him, do with him. We don't really know anything about Chimham. We don't know what he did to earn Barzillai's approval and recommendation. But David obviously knows some things that we're not told in Scripture, and he says, whatever you ask me to do, I'll do that. What an offer. I mean, really, what an offer. I mean, this is King of Israel, and he has placed himself in a position of obligation, and I just think that's so beautiful of a thing for him to do. The mention is made in verse 40 that all the people of Judah conducted the king and half of the people of Israel, and this is building up to something here. There was some division about whether Israel or Judah had a greater right to David as their king. And God's going to turn this around because David is going to unite the 12 tribes of Israel again under one throne. And Solomon will reap those benefits. And unfortunately, Solomon's children, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, one is his child. I think Jeroboam is his. Rehoboam was, I think, a servant. I can't remember. But they end up splitting the kingdom. So 2 generations later. But David and Solomon will enjoy a united kingdom of all 12 tribes of God's people under one throne. And so this kind of, they don't really show the resolution of this here, but both sides begin to kind of argue about who has a bigger right to David as their king. In spite of all this, David still finds resistance from the house of Saul. Look at chapter 20, and we'll read from verse 6. And David said to Abishai, Now shall Sheba the son of Bichri do us more harm than did Absalom, that thou take thou thy Lord's servants and pursue after him, lest he get him fenced cities and escape us. Sheba was of the Benjamite, and he says, I will never call David my king. You can remember the while back, not my president, right? It's kind of what he's, not my king. There is nothing new under the sun. Not my king. He had his own little political pin that he wore all over, all over the tribe of Benjamin. Not my king. Kind of like we have with the people who are like, he's not my president, kind of garbage. Well, whether you like it or not, if that's who God has anointed as the leader, he's your leader. Sorry, whatever you think about it. But he kind of had that kind of an attitude. People haven't changed much in 3,000 years, evidently. But Sheba of Benjamin refused to call David his king. So David went to Jerusalem and took care of the rest of the days, but never again slept with the 10 concubines that Absalom had violated. And he took care of them the rest of their days, but basically the Bible actually uses the term that they lived in widowhood. But he did fulfill an obligation to them in taking care of their physical needs for the rest of their days. Now, David sends Amasa to assemble the men of Judah to pursue after Sheba, because he's, like I said in verse 6 here, it says that he'll do more harm than Absalom even thought about doing. Look at verse 7, and there went out after him Joab's men and the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. These are the mighty men, all right? The Cherethites were... we'll talk about them in a second. Let's actually finish our reading first. To pursue after Sheba the son of Bichri. When they were at the great stone which is in Gibeon, Amasa went before them. Remember, he's now the general. Joab's garment that he had put on was girded upon him, and upon it a girdle with a sword fastened upon his loins in the sheath thereof. And as he went forth, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, Art thou in health, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with the right hand to kiss him, and Amasa took no heed to the sword that was in Joab's hand. So he smote him therewith in the 5th rib, and shed out his bowels to the ground, and struck him not again, and he died. So Joab and Abishai his brother pursued after Sheba the son of Bichri. And one of Joab's men stood by him and said, He that favoreth Joab, and he that is for David, let him go after Joab. And Amasa wallowed in blood in the midst of the highway. And when the man saw that all the people stood still, he removed Amasa out of the highway into the field and cast a cloth upon him, when he saw that everyone that came by him stood still. When he was removed out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue after Sheba the son of Bichri. And he went through all the tribes of Israel unto Abel and unto Bethmaachah and all the Berites and all that were gathered together went also after him. And they came and besieged him in Abel of Bethmaachah, and they cast up a bank against the city and stood in the trench, and all the people that were with Joab battered the wall to throw it down. And they cried, A wise woman out of the city, Hear, hear, say, I pray unto Joab, come near hither, that I may speak with thee. And when he was come near unto her, the woman said, Art thou Joab? And he answered, I am he. Then she said unto him, Hear the words of thine handmaid. And he answered, I do hear. Then she spake, saying, There were wont to speak in old times, saying, Thou shalt surely ask a counsel at Abel. And so they ended the matter. I am one of them that are peaceable and faithful in Israel. Thou seekest to destroy a city and a mother in Israel. Why wilt thou swallow up the inheritance of the Lord? She puts a perspective on it. Now, she could have just been wrangling a little bit to save her life. Don't destroy a mother of Israel. But the bottom line is, what damage they do to the inheritance that God has given them. And she reminded him of that. Verse 20, And Joab answered and said, Far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. The matter is not so, but a man of Mount Ephraim, Sheba the son of Bichri by name, hath lifted up his hand against the king, even against David. Deliver him only, and I will depart from the city. And the woman said unto Joab, Behold, his head shall be thrown over the wall. Which I love that. There's some pretty gutsy ladies in the Bible. That's a fun study. Jael just went over and nailed a hammer through, what's his name, over in Judges? Drove a nail through his temples. That's some pretty rough women in the Bible. This is one of them. Well, throw his head over the wall. Verse 22, Then the woman went unto all the people in her wisdom. And they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and cast it out to Joab. And he blew a trumpet. They retired from the city, every man to his tent. And Joab returned to Jerusalem. unto the king. So this is a little bit of a funny story, but of all the people in the city, this woman goes to Joab and says, "Are you Joab?" And Joab's like, "Yes, this is me." And she says, why are you gonna destroy God's people? Why are you gonna mar the inheritance of the Lord? What does he want? And so they have this conversation like over a city wall, which I just think is kind of hysterical. Throw his head out. Okay, we'll do that. So they kill Sheba, the Benjamite. They throw his head over the wall, and Joab's like, "I'm good." They take the army back, and they disband. At this point, David sets up a new cabinet, and this stands this way. And we're not going to read the how or the whys, but Joab is returned to his position as captain of the army. Now, obviously, Amasa is dead, who was set up by Absalom. Joab is removed by David as captain, but now he's restored. He's once again captain of the army. I don't have all the answers. We're not told exactly why. It could be that David does recognize Joab is a valiant man. He's got his hang-ups, don't we all? But he is a valiant man. But right now, Joab is restored to the position of captain of the army. Then Benaiah was captain of the Cherethites. Now, I said we would talk about those. The Cherethites were basically the king's personal guard, and the Pelethites were the king's official messengers. He talked about the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And then there's Adoram, the chief tax collector, Jehoshaphat, the court recorder, Sheva, the chief religious scribe, Zadok was a priest, Abiathar was a priest, and Ira was David's personal priest. Somebody he took around with him, you might say like the military chaplain, kind of a deal there. So we take a look now at chapter 21, and some things change. The kingdom settles down. The kingdom unites under David. And some other things begin to happen. David begins to make peace and to right some old wrongs and to settle into who he is and establishing the house of David as the reigning family, the ruling royal family of Israel. So chapter 21, we'll read verses 1 through 6 here. Then there was a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, "It is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites." And the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them, now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the children of Israel had sworn unto them, and Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And wherewith shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said unto him, Well, we will have no silver, nor gold of Saul, nor of his house. Neither of us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. And he said, What ye shall say, that will I do for you. David said, we got to make this right. There's been a famine. One of the questions I asked myself when I was reading this was, how come it took David 3 years before he went to God? But, let's think practically. Number one, we don't always do it right either. But even so, you got to think that everyone has a bad year. There are years that are just bad crops. It's just the way it is. You think, okay, well, we got next year. We have some store laid up, and so we'll be fine. We'll plant next year. It'll be better. But now 2 years have passed, and now 3 years have passed, and David's interest has peaked, and he's thinking, okay, now God, you're really saying something here, I think. It's clear that this is God's doing. So I think we might want to not be so hasty in saying, how come it took David 3 years to respond to God's hand of judgment on Israel because of the house of Saul. It was 3 years of famine, but David went to God, and I think that's what we need to look at. When the physical circumstances became obvious to David that this was something spiritual, David went to God. The Gibeonites are requited. Saul wrongfully kills some Gibeonites, and David asked him, what price? Whatever you say, we'll do that. We'll settle this claim. Let's get this taken care of, because this has gone on long enough. And so this is what the Gibeonites say. In verse 4, 5. We already read verse 4. Verse 5. And they answered the king, the man that consumed us, and that devised against us that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coasts of Israel, let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bare unto Saul, Armoni, and Mephibosheth. Now this obviously is a different Mephibosheth. So there were 2 cousins, both with the name Mephibosheth. And the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she had brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. And I did not take the time to go through and get all the families, how that went, how that all worked out, and develop a family tree. But it would be an interesting study for somebody to do sometime. Barzillai, remember the old man who would not cross over with David? His son Adriel ended up marrying David's wife Michal. Kind of messed up, but their kids, and I by the way, I believe it's his kids, but she brings them up, is what the way the Bible puts that. Those 5 boys and the 2 sons of the other son of Saul are who he delivers over to the Gibeonites. He delivered them in the hands of the Gibeonites. They hanged them in the hill before the Lord. And they fell all 7 together and were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of barley harvest. So the Gibeonites are requited of their claim against the house of Saul. And obviously God is in this. We don't understand everything about this time period. We don't have all the culture down. But God was judging Israel because of its leadership's issues. And David requites the issues. And evidently God's okay with this because the problem goes away. So we don't have all the information maybe. And we don't understand the culture entirely or the time period. But I will say that when the Gibeonites were requited in this manner, God said, okay, it's taken care of. David then gives Israel's first dynasty a proper burial, which is something his own son Absalom never even got a chance to do. And again, this really speaks to David's respect for Saul and for Jonathan and for the house of Saul. So verse 10 of chapter 21, and Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth, spread it for her upon the rock from the beginning of the harvest until water dropped upon them out of heaven, and suffered neither the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night, and was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, which had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them, when the Philistines had slain Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up from thence the bones of Saul, the bones of Jonathan his son, and they gathered the bones of them that were hanged. And the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin and Zelah in the sepulchre of Kish his father. And they performed all that the king commanded. And after that God was entreated for the land. So David had a part to play here. David kind of hadn't wrapped up this chapter of his life either. Saul and Jonathan's bones were still down in Gilboa. And when the Gibeonites were requited of their claim against the house of Saul, David took them and wrapped up his own past, gave them the proper respect for burial they deserved because of who they were, by God's choice, by God's design, and did that. And it says, then is the Lord was happy with that. After that, God was entreated for the land. And God once again began to bless the land of Israel and remove the famine from the land. Now, David's got some more cleanup to do. He's not done. There's still other issues. Remember that when David killed Goliath, he brought 5 stones. And we learn from the scripture that Goliath had 4 brothers. And I've heard some preachers say you can't say for sure that was his intent. He just picked up 5 stones in case he'd missed. Maybe. We don't really know his motives. But it seems like there are some giants left in David's life that were not taken care of. And it's time that happens also. And so David's really cleaning up his past, and some of his giants returned to haunt him. Let's take a look at verse 15 together. Moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel, and David went down and his servants with him and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. We've not heard this before. We've heard that he got hungry and was given the showbread to eat. We've heard, that he needed refreshing. This is the first time he has waxed faint. And this is interesting. And Ishbi-benob, which I just love to say that name. It's just an awesome name. It's too bad we're done having children. You know what I'm saying? Ishbi-benob. It's just so much fun to say. And Ishbi-benob, which was of the sons of the giant, whose weight, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. Ishbi-benob was the son of Goliath. And Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him. So he took care of David, made sure he was safe, and then he went after Ishbi-benob himself. And then the men of David swear unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. So they're recognizing David's starting to show his age. It happens to the best of us. We all get old. David's a mighty warrior, and he's in battle, and for the first time in his life, he waxes faint. He tires. And this is not David's norm. This is not the pattern. This is not the warrior David that we know. And his men say, we don't want our king killed in battle. And so when we go out to battle, we'll do what you say, but you can't come out on the battlefield anymore, Your Majesty. And so David is kind of retired from active military service there due to his age. We're not done killing off giants, though. Verse 18, and it came to pass after this that there was once again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite slew Saph, which was of the sons of the giants, so another son of Goliath. And there was again a battle in Gob and with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jehoiargim, all right, and I'm sure I'm butchering that, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. All right, so now we've taken out a brother of Goliath. Verse 20, and there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he was also born to the giant. So this is a third son of Goliath. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimea, the brother of David, slew him. So here we have another nephew of David. And I just think this is awesome because if you remember, David's the youngest. David's the youngest. And it speaks volumes to me because if my memory serves, Shimea was, I believe, David's oldest brother, although I could be wrong about that, but he was an older brother than David. Let me ask you a question. If you were the oldest, or you had a younger brother and sister, and they became king, how much do you think you'd respect them? I mean, think about that for a minute. He's just keeping sheep. He just watches the father's sheep when the prophet comes to anoint him. And yet, Jonathan, nephew of David, serves David in the military, and I have to ask where he got that kind of respect from, and I think it was modeled for him by his father. Shimea, when he recognized that David was the Lord's anointed, and undeniably so, I think that he respected David. And that respect transferred to the next generation, who also respected David and literally became, in fact, I believe there's 1 or 2 Jonathans in this list, I can't remember. I suspect that one of these mighty men, some of these, are actually from David's family. And I think that's just a wonderful thing, that it's a picture of when we all get behind God's program. Quite the opposite of Saul, right? Quite the opposite of Joab. When we get behind God's program, we will see our giants fall. In fact, look what verse 22 says. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Because they were all on the same page. They were all working together. They were all respectful of the authorities that God had placed over them, regardless of what earthly culture would have dictated, regardless of personal feelings from growing up. Regardless of these things, we see submission to proper authority in the fear of God, and the giants fall. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Then in chapter 22, this has been kind of a survey of David's life, and we've inserted different hymns and psalms in there, and David now writes a hymn of praise for their deliverance, and it's not in Psalms. It's here in 2 Samuel. It's a little lengthy, but we have really focused on the Psalms of David in this, and so I want to read it anyway. This is quite likely the last psalm he wrote. Why? Because the last words of David are recorded immediately after it, in verses 1 through 7 in chapter 23. I could be wrong about that. There may be more time and that we're not told about, but I suspect one of the reasons such a lengthy composition has been preserved for us is it probably is David's last. So, having said that, this is David's hymn of praise for deliverance. And David spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. And he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, the God of my rock, in him will I trust. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my high tower and my refuge, my Savior. Thou savest me from violence. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. When the waves of death compassed me, the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried to my God. And he did hear my voice out of his temple, and my cry did enter into his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of heaven moved and shook because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and did fly. And he was seen upon the wings of the wind. And he made darkness pavilions round about him, dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. Through the brightness before him were coals of fire kindled. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and discomfited them. And the channels of the sea appeared. The foundations of the world were discovered. At the rebuking of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils, he sent me from above. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands hath he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and as for his statutes, I did not depart from them. I was also upright before him, and have kept myself from iniquity. Therefore the Lord hath recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness in his eyesight. With the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful, and with the upright man thou wilt show thyself upright. With the pure wilt thou show thyself pure, and with the froward wilt thou show thyself unsavory. And the afflicted people thou wilt save, but thine eyes are upon the haughty, that thou mayest bring them down. For thou art my lamp, O Lord, and the Lord will lighten my darkness. For by thee I have run through a troop. By my God have I leapt over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a buckler to all them that trust in him. For who is God save the Lord? And who is a rock save our God? He is my strength and power, and he maketh my way perfect. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and setteth me upon my high places. He teacheth my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken by mine arms. He teacheth my hands to war. I read that. Thou hast also given me the shield of thy salvation, and thy gentleness hath made me great. Thou hast enlarged my steps under me, so that my feet did not slip. I have pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and turned not again until I had consumed them. I have consumed them and wounded them, and they could not arise. Yea, they are fallen under my feet. For thou hast girded me with strength to battle. Them that rose up against me hast thou subdued under me. Thou hast also given me the necks of mine enemies, that I might destroy them that hate me. They looked, but there was none to save, even unto the Lord. But he answered them not. Then did I beat them as small as the dust of the earth. I did stamp them as the mire of the street, and did spread them abroad. Thou also hast delivered me from the strivings of my people. Thou hast kept me to be the head of the heathen. A people which I knew not shall serve me. Strangers shall submit themselves unto me. As soon as they hear, they shall be obedient unto me. Strangers shall fade away, and they shall be afraid out of their close places. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of the rock of my salvation. It is God that avengeth me, and that bringeth down the people under me, and that bringeth me forth from mine enemies. Thou also hast lifted me up on high above them that rose up against me. Thou hast delivered me from the violent man. Therefore I will give thanks unto thee, O Lord, among the heathen, and I will sing praises unto thy name. He is the tower of salvation for his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, unto David, and to his seed forevermore. Beautiful. Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And then moving immediately into chapter 23, these be the last words of David, king of Israel. David the son of Jesse, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel, said. Before we actually read those words, usually a man's last words are his most important. They're the last thing he wants to communicate, perhaps love to his family or final instructions for something. They're considered vitally important. And these are the same. And this is what David had to say in these last 6 verses, verses 2 through 7. The Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spake to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning, when the sun riseth, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass, springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. Although my house be not so with God, yet he that made with me an everlasting covenant. By the way, that everlasting covenant's not over yet. Jesus is going to come back and set up that kingdom without end. And then will God's covenant be fulfilled with David. David kept God, he took God at his word. Or, I'll just start verse 5 over. Although my house be not so with God, yet he hath made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things, and sure, for this is all my salvation, and all my desire, although he make it not to grow. But the sons of Belial shall be all of them as thorns thrust away, because they cannot be taken with hands. But the man that shall touch them must be fenced with iron, and a staff of a spear, and they shall be utterly burned with fire in the same place. Last words of David. He recognizes that his authority and his power and all that he's been able to accomplish in his reign is because of God. And then he goes through in the rest of chapter 23 and names his mighty men. And so let's take a look at the mighty men. We're going to be in Psalm 56 here in just a minute because there's a parenthetical story here in this list, and so we'll look at it at a piece of that story and a psalm that was written during that segment of David's life. But let's take a look. Like I said before, if God thought it necessary to remind us of all 37 of David's mighty men, then it seems to me that it would be good for us to remember these veterans of the Lord for Israel and the house of David. So let's take a look. Now, when I went through and I counted, because I'm like that, I can't help it, it's just the way that I am, I counted 36. But the very last verse of chapter 23 clearly says 37. I think it's counting David. And I think that's where the 37th man comes in. I think it's David and his mighty men, not just David's mighty men. Or David was also one of these mighty men. So we have David, and under him was Adino. Now he's the chief captain of the mighty men. He slew 800 men in one battle with a spear. That's a mighty man. I probably couldn't get a spear to fly straight 10 feet. He's killed 800 people in one battle. Beneath him, beneath Adino, was Eleazar. Eleazar is next in command. He stood his ground with the two other mighty men and David when all others fled before the Philistines. And they fought all day until their hand cramped to the sword, and God gave a great victory in that battle. That's Eleazar, Adino, David, and Shammah, who's the third man in command. He defended a field of lentils by himself against a whole troop of Philistines, and defeated them. So we're talking about some mighty men of battle here. These guys knew how to wield a weapon. They knew how to endure through the hardship of war, and that's who these are. Then we have three mighty men listed as David's three mighty men who were next in command beneath these three. So we have a definite command structure here to David's military. So there's the three mighty men. It's Abishai, and Abishai, Benaiah, and Asahel. These three went into Bethlehem when it was under the occupation of the Philistines, because David, who had been captured by the Philistines, said, boy, I wish I could have a drink of water from that well in Bethlehem. By the way, that well is still there in Bethlehem. You can see it. But anyway, these three said, the king wishes it, let's go do it. So they sneak out of the enemy into the enemy stronghold, grab water and bring it back for David, and he dumps it out on the ground and offer to the Lord. He said, I can't take of this offering of these people's risk, and he gave it to God, which I think is I don't know, when I think of it, maybe this felt a little rude maybe, but for David, it meant something that these men were willing to risk their very lives for a wish. And David decided to take these men's service and in a tangible manner offer it back to God, which is actually really, really cool. But during that time, David writes Psalm 56. So we'll get back to this list of names here in just a second. But Psalm 56, to the chief musician, upon Jonath the Lemrochim, all right, and that literally means, hang on a minute, I have my notes here, the silent dove in distant places. Now, that doesn't hardly sound like anything out of a battle or praise to God. It probably was a popular tune, the name of a popular tune of that day. That would have been well known, and so people would have known to sing these lyrics to that tune. At least that's the way some people look at it. Then it says Miktam of David, which is a golden psalm, probably engraved for posterity, of significant importance. Only 6 psalms claim this distinction. We've talked about this already, Psalm 16 and then 56 through 60. And it was written on the special occasion of David's capture in Gath. This is what Psalm 56 says. Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresseth me. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O thou most high. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. In God I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Every day they wrest my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. Shall they escape by iniquity? In thine anger cast down thy people, O God, the people, O God. Thou tellest my wanderings. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? When I cry unto thee, then shall mine enemies turn back. For this I know, for God is for me. In God will I praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praises unto thee, for thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? Wonderful words. Just incredibly hopeful. You know, I don't care what you're going through. We can put our trust in God. We have our confidence in God that he longs for us to walk in the light of the living. we, as David says, I will put my trust in God. I will put my trust in His Word. And I think the reason that we freak out sometimes in times when when we are afraid is because we don't stay in contact with God. We don't talk to Him in prayer. We don't praise Him. We don't read His Word. And when perilous times come upon us, we don't have that store and resource of a current ongoing relationship with God, and we crash and burn. We need to stay in contact with God at all times. And when trouble comes, we can rely on our friend God. And I just think that is a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful thing. So it's at that time that David penned Psalm 56. Now, the three mighty men, Abishai was actually a brother of Joab. And he was the first in command of the three special forces of David. They killed 300 men. Abishai killed 300 men in one battle with his spear. Now, I know it's not 800 like Adino. He only killed a mere 300. But still, mighty feat. Mighty, mighty feat. Under him then was Benaiah. He killed 2 valiant men of Moab, killed a lion in a pit in the winter with snow on the ground. He killed a strong Egyptian by using his staff to disarm the Egyptian of his spear, and then killed the Egyptian with his own spear, and was captain of David's personal guard. Remember the Cherethites? David's personal guard. Then Asahel was the last of the 3 mighty men. It was another brother of Joab. All right, so again, there are family connections all through this. Here you have Jonathan, Attai was mentioned, Benaiah. Some of these men, I think, were actually intimately connected to David as family. Notice the last, by the way, Uriah the Hittite. But we'll read all these names because I think God thought it was important enough. Let's take a look. There's Elhanan, Shammah. By the way, this is a different one. And if you question that, there's another one over here. So Shammah, Elika, Helez, Ira, Abiezer, Mebaniah, Zalman, Maharai, Heleb, Attai, Benaiah, Hidai, Abialban, Asmaveth, Eliabah, Jonathan, Shammah, a third one, Ahiam, Eliphalet, who I think we've heard from before, actually, Eliam, Hezray, Peare, Igal, Bani, Zelek, Bani, right? Zelek, Nahare, Ira. There's another Ira. Okay, different man. Gareb, and then Uriah the Hittite. And when you go through and you read them in the Bible, a lot of times it says the son of or from this particular region and so on. Nahari was the armor bearer of Joab, and so it makes me wonder if maybe he wasn't in on killing Absalom. But anyway, when you look at that, there's 37 men in total written on this board, mighty men of David, David himself, and wow, what a wonderful, wonderful thing they did for the nation of Israel, conquering her enemies, doing justice, fulfilling God's sword of justice, quite literally, and rectifying situations with the house of Saul and the Philistines, and just did amazing, amazing feats. They were specially prepared by God and assembled by Him, placed under the authority of David to work His will and His purposes in the land of Israel. Now, we have one more class. Believe it or not, we are almost to the end. I know I said we had David's last words. We're going to actually look at David's deathbed and the ascension of Solomon, which is probably one of the most beautiful stories in David's life. I just love it. It's full of intrigue, and it's just a really interesting story about how Solomon ascends to the throne because yet another son of David decides that he ought to be king. And God says, no, Solomon's the one that I've chosen. And it's just a beautiful thing. So we'll pick up on the last lesson of this series next time.